Well, thanks for having me. It's exciting to be talking at a time slot that Bill Gates is also talking at, and have all you people in the room here listening to me. So thank you for that. So yeah, as Vinod said, I've had the fortune of working on a bunch of products that you've probably heard of, Bump and Google Photos probably being the big ones. I've also worked on a bunch of products that you did not hear about because they were big failures, and I learned a bunch from that, and so I'm going to kind of tell you that story today. So let me find my clicker here. All right. So this story that I'm going to tell you begins in business school at the University of Chicago. This photo was taken actually the day before I dropped out of business school, and it's literally the last time I wore a suit for work, which is really fun. So in business school, I had this random idea for an app that would make it easier for me to share my phone number with my new classmates. I called it Bump. The idea is that you would literally bump your phones together, like these two folks, and with a little algorithmic magic, the info would be transferred. So this is an actual image from our Series A deck, and that's my mom and my sister. So we built it with a couple of friends, and we launched it, and people started using it. Lots of them. It quickly became one of the most popular apps on the App Store. Here we are at number 2 on the App Store. I think this was in August of 2010. And we never were able to knock off iGlowStick, which really irks me still. Apple put us in an international TV commercial that ran during Dancing with the Stars. People we didn't know dressed up as Bump for Halloween. And I'm pretty sure even Steve Jobs heard of it. So it ended up getting over 150 million installs, and people seem to just get it and love it. So on a whim, we added a photo sharing feature to Bump. And photo sharing quickly emerged as the top use case. Our best users were bumping dozens of photos per week, but we were pretty confused. Bump is kind of like the hardest possible product to use to share photos. You have to both be in the same place. You have to stop what you're doing. You have to pull out your phone. You both have to have the app installed. You have to open it. And then you literally have to touch each other in order to share a photo. Like, it's pretty much the most friction you could possibly create. So we thought, all right, this photo sharing thing seems really big. Imagine if we actually tried and built a product that was designed for photo sharing. So we built a new app that could predict which photos people were going to bump to each other before they bumped. And it let them share automatically from anywhere without that physical kind of friction. We called it Flock, and people really loved it. A small group of people really loved it, including the team that built it and some of our friends. But it totally failed compared to Bump. And the major difference was this idea of cognitive simplicity. So Bump had it, and Flock didn't. And honestly, probably the only reason that I'm here today, and Vinod asked me to come talk, is that we recognized this problem, and we built a third app that took the photo sharing kind of magic of Flock and put it into a much cognitively simpler frame of a photo gallery app. We called it Photo Roll. We actually never launched it. We showed it to Google. They acquired us. And then a couple of years later, it reemerged as Google Photos. So let me tell you what the heck I mean by cognitive simplicity. So simplicity in products is not a new idea. For decades, some of the most successful products would probably be best described as simple. And in the last decade, as software products have become fully mainstream, it's a trend you see pretty much everywhere. But simple comes in many dimensions. Sometimes it's the number of buttons on an interface. Sometimes it's a clean visual interface. Or it could be the number of features, or the steps in a flow, or the time needed to complete a flow. These are all dimensions of simplicity that really matter. But the one that matters most, I've learned, is cognitive simplicity. There it is, cognitive simplicity. And its nemesis, cognitive overhead. OK, so let's define this really precisely. Here is a definition on the internet that I found from somebody that I've never met. It says, cognitive overhead is how many logical connections or jumps your brain has to make in order to understand or contextualize the thing you're looking at. So how many logical connections in order to understand or contextualize? OK, now I'm no brain scientist, but I am really good at Googling stuff on the internet. And I found all sorts of research around human cognition and evolution, and the notion that our brains work by grouping things and concepts relative to known things and concepts, and then considering all things that we see in the future relative to what we already know. So let me give you an example that might actually be true. So early humans, we saw what happens when something runs towards something else, generally bad things. Those of us that are able to abstract that into a concept that any time an object rapidly approaches, it's probably not a good thing, well, we were able to pass those genes down to our descendants, and that's what we have now today. So our brains are actually literally hardwired to operate this way, to take things and concepts and abstract them relative to known things and concepts. And the more jumps that we make our brains go through, the harder it is to use a product. So you might be thinking, cool talk so far, Dave, but like we don't have lions running around attacking us, so can we just get moving? Not yet. Check this out. So this is what your user looked like 15 years ago if you were building software. Just your user alone in a nice quiet room with a coffee on a big monitor, no distractions, ample time to understand your complex product. This is what your users look like today. Mobile has imposed this huge new challenge of distraction and context, and cognitive simplicity is more critical than ever. We've all been there, you know it. All right, so let's look at a couple examples to illustrate cognitive overhead and what it looks like. So first, let me start with a couple bad examples. All right, first example, one of my favorites, QR codes. These things were literally designed for simplicity. Short number of steps, ubiquity, quick to use, but they totally dropped the ball on cognitive simplicity. So it's a barcode? No, it's a website. Got it. But I don't use a browser? I'm supposed to take a picture of it? OK, so I get my camera out and I take a picture of it. Oh, but I can't use my camera. I have to go download a separate QR code scanning app? Got it. Cognitive disaster, right? It took like literally a decade before anybody really understood how to use these, at least in the United States. And today, they're really only used for boarding passes and ticketing. Like, it's kind of a problem. Another example, iCloud. We all remember when Steve got on stage and announced iCloud, right? It was going to be this beautiful future where all of our files were like seamlessly synchronized between all of our devices. And it looked on the surface like classic Apple simplicity. But in practice, iCloud was rife with cognitive overhead. It's not clear what syncs and what doesn't. Parts of it are free, but then you always wake up in the morning to that alert saying that you're out of iCloud space and you have to buy more. There's no easy place to see all your stuff in one place online. And good luck unless you're all in on Apple devices. So again, great intentions, really simplistic product in many dimensions, but on the cognitive front, I would say it's really, really complex. OK, next, a couple of good examples, products that do this really well. First example, one of my favorites, is WhatsApp. So you don't see WhatsApp appear on Dribbble very often. It's not one of the most beautiful products that one could create. But it excels at cognitive simplicity. A couple ways. First, it relies on phone number, right? You have to have someone's phone number in order to send them a WhatsApp message. This is very different than a lot of the other messaging apps that came out in that era that had kind of lower barriers. You could friend someone in many different ways and send them a message. And so that you might look at that and think it was very limiting. But I argue that that cognitive simplicity that they had actually allowed the product to grow really quickly because people could understand it relative to SMS. It was basically SMS, but free. Another example, WhatsApp was really slow to add new features. Like, I remember I met with Jan in 2013, and this was right when all the other messaging apps were starting to add voice calling and video calling and all these new features and like an app store inside their apps. And he was pretty unapologetic. He was just like, yeah, we're just going to focus on messaging. That's all that we're going to do. And they're still largely focusing on messaging, and it worked out pretty well for them. All right, another example, Google Photos. I'm allowed to do that because I'm the speaker. So let's just look at one specific feature inside of Google Photos. It's a feature that we call free up space. You've probably all experienced this. You're going to take a photo, and then your phone tells you you can't take the photo because you have no more space on your phone. So basically, this feature is a button that you press, and it deletes any photos that are on your device that have already been backed up to Google Photos. Really simple, really easy to use. So the engineers in the room, are there any engineers in the room? There must be. Yes, great. OK, good. You guys might look at this and say, well, there's probably a better solution for this. You could kind of automatically do this continuously in the background for the user. Look at any photos that have been backed up, kind of downsize them, store a thumbnail image, do some smart caching. And that would be like theoretically far better for the user, right? In fact, that's what one of our competitors does. They call it optimize iPhone storage. Seems really simple and potentially simpler than our solution. But cognitively, I argue that that solution is far more complex. So why can't I see certain photos when I'm offline? Oh, it's removed them from my device? OK, well, how does it decide when it does that? And when do I know that it's doing that? Again, cognitive disaster. So in this case, the strictly worse engineering solution, the one that requires the user to go in and press a button, I argue is actually better from a cognitive perspective because the user understands what's going on and knows how to use it. And the other advantage is we can make fun TV commercials that poke fun at Apple. So we do that too. All right. Finally, I want to leave you with a toolkit with 3 tangible techniques for reducing cognitive overhead. And then I'm going to give you a pro tip for diagnosing how you're doing. All right. Technique number 1. Make people work less. That's too intuitive. Make people work more. So by putting your user in the middle of the action, you give them a better idea of what's going on. If you make them tap that extra button, or you take a flow that you could have achieved in 1 screen and stretch it out into 3 screens, you're going to actually reduce the cognitive overhead that your users have. So this was actually the magic of Bump. With Bump, the user was physically in the middle of the transaction, right? You had to bump your phones together to make it work. And so it made the product much more easy to comprehend. Another example, Shazam, the song identification app. I'm pretty sure that when you open that app, you still have to press a button that says tap to Shazam in order to get to work, when like literally I'm sure 99.9% of the time people open that app, they're going to press that button. So they could have removed that step, but by keeping it there, the user understands how this thing works and how to make it do the job that they're asking it to do. One more example, I think this one's really interesting. You know when you install an app on your Mac and you get that little thing that tells you to drag the icon onto your launcher or whatever? They could easily remove that step and not have me have to do that. But by making me do that, I get a better understanding of OK, I'm actually installing a new app onto my computer, and it's going to be there in the future. All right, let's move on to technique number 2. Speed up your product. Nope, slow it down. So we've probably all heard these stories about how relentless Google is at trying to get our search result speeds really, really quick. But sometimes it actually goes the other way. You might have heard these academic research papers about how flight search apps actually intentionally slow down their search results in order for the user to understand what the heck this thing is doing, searching all these other sites. And it actually makes the users have a higher perceived value of those products. So the idea is if the user can see the app working, doing all this work on its behalf, they really appreciate it much more, and they understand the machinery that's going on. So I think this technique really is important if your product is complicated and is doing some really difficult thing on behalf of users. All right. Last but not least, technique number 3. Make your product look and feel new. You've probably guessed my approach here so far. So make your product look and feel ordinary. So this gets back to that cognition research I was talking about. The brain pattern matches and abstracts new things relative to known things. So if you make your product look and feel like the old, boring product that it's replacing, your users will actually have an easier time getting it. So obviously, you want to differentiate in select places. You want to show how your product is new and novel and innovative. But you can inherit a lot of comprehension by positioning your product relative to a known product. So this is the big insight that we had with Flock and PhotoRoll and now Google Photos. By pivoting into a photo gallery app that everybody already understood, we could kind of inherit that understanding and then bolt on the photo sharing and all the new AI stuff that we're doing in a way that people kind of understood. The alternative, which we tried with Flock, was to build this new innovative photo sharing app. And what we found is it was too cognitively complex for people to really understand. You see this in lots of other places also. You look at Google Docs, it is pretty much a straight copy from a usability and design context from Microsoft Word. If you look at your music streaming app, it's pretty much a copy of what you had on your iPod, which is pretty much a copy of what you had on your CD player, which is pretty much a copy of what you had on your record player. Again, these are all, I think, deliberate choices to try to make products easier to comprehend. All right, finally, how do you know how you're doing? I have a foolproof method to help you understand how much cognitive overhead you have in your product. And the idea is really simple. It's to have people use your product and then ask them 2 things. What does it do, and how do you use it? That's it. What does it do? How do you use it? What this lets you do is observe whether they can successfully use the product, and also helps you understand how they understand it relative to other things. So if you don't get answers to these 2 questions that make sense to you, you have a problem. Now, this process seems pretty normal for those of us who are product designers in the room. It's like literally what we do every day. But there's a twist. And the twist is that you need to find a special group of people. People that aren't accustomed to the product pattern matching stuff that our brains are used to doing as product designers. Kind of like a canary in the coal mine sort of thing. If you test on this special group, you're going to identify these issues much more quickly. And if they can pass this test, if they can explain what your product does and how to use it, you know you're golden. So where do you find these special cognitively challenged people? The old and the young. The brains of these 2 groups haven't built up all these product pattern matching abilities that we all take for granted. So they make great cognitive overhead detectors. This is actually my nephew and my parents. And so when I go home, I learn a ton about my products when I ask them to use it and see how they understand it. I'm actually going home this weekend, and I'm going to try to show my product to my 103-year-old grandmother on her birthday and see what I learn. It's going to be very fascinating. So what do you do when you don't have old or young people around to talk to? Luckily, there is a surefire way to convert a normally cognitively not challenged person into a cognitively challenged person. Does anybody know the answer? Give them a few drinks. So I'm really serious about this. Drunk people are great approximations of the distracted, busy, fickle users that you're going to encounter in the real world. At Bump, we would actually take our entire team, to bars in Palo Alto and San Francisco and do this sort of research, ask people these exact questions. This is actually a photo of us doing this research in one of these sessions. The added benefit of doing this is that drunk people are never shy with their feedback, so they will always tell you something. And so you just need to understand how to listen to them. So in conclusion, go look at your own products and see if you pass this young, old, and drunk test. And if not, think about how you can make the user do more work, or how you could take your product and slow it down, or how you could make it look and feel like something really ordinary. And if you want to talk to me about your product and ask me how to use it and what it's for, I'll see you later tonight at the bar. Thanks, everybody. That's all. Do we have any time for Q&A? Does anyone have any Qs?
We'll take a couple of questions.
All right. Yes, front row. Do you want to get a mic? Oh, look at that.
Do you have any comments to make on Snap's new design snafu and what happened there?
In a previous version of this talk, I actually used Snapchat as an example, and I tried to let the crowd decide whether they thought Snap had high cognitive overhead or low cognitive overhead. When I've given this talk before and asked that question, the audience generally says that Snap is like really bad from a cognitive perspective. I kind of disagree, actually. Like, I think that from a design perspective on all these other dimensions about like layout and color scheme and buttons and all these things, I think it's a disaster. I think they could dramatically improve it. But cognitively, I actually think they're doing pretty well. The new redesign, I think you could debate whether it's gone up or down. But in general, the idea that Snapchat is an app that you use to send disappearing photos to people, kind of like SMS, I think that's actually like pretty accessible to people and pretty cognitively simple. So that's my take on it. But like, there's obviously a lot of things that they could change from a usability perspective. All right, there's a question there?
So part of building a great consumer product is actually having a great consumer product culture in the team and sensibility, particularly because so much of it is instinct and just calling it. How are you able to do that in such a large company?
Yeah. My first answer is that I don't feel like Google Photos is a large company. We're a pretty small team. We sit in our own building. To me, it feels like my startup just has grown over the last 5 years, as opposed to joining a big new company. I think that really there's, I guess, 2 things I would recommend. Number one is make sure you have a very clear mission about why you're building whatever you're building. This is like one of the things that I think differentiates Google Photos from other products at big companies is when we started working on this, like everyone on the team was aligned on a very, very clear mission about what we're doing and what we're not doing. So I think that's number one. And I think number 2 is to build a culture where you go out and talk to your users. This is something I learned in Y Combinator. It's like the first thing that Paul Graham taught us, which was when you're stuck, go talk to your users. They will tell you what they want. It's very simple. And I think in bigger organizations, everybody gets very specialized, and you kind of lose that idea that it's everyone's responsibility to understand the user and have empathy. So things that we do at Google Photos, like we do an annual trip where we take more than a dozen of our team selected from across all the functions, and we like fly to a totally different place in the world and just live there for a week and talk to users and try to understand what's going on. So I think perpetuating cultures like that are a good tool. Who has a microphone next? There.
Does the process of diagnosing whether your product has cognitive load or not differ between a consumer and an enterprise product?
Yeah, probably. I've never built an enterprise product, so I have no idea, honestly, what you need to do there. I think it's probably very similar, though. In an enterprise case, the one difference I can think of is that maybe the person making the purchase decision or the usage decision is different than the actual end user. So I think you need to think about that. It probably makes it a little bit more complicated. But I think the idea of watching people use the product and asking them like what it's for, what job does this product solve, if you don't get really clear answers on that, then you need to rethink what you're doing. And I think that probably applies in consumer and in enterprise.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm Slav, Mighty Buildings. We're 3D print studios, actually also IC company. So we learn all these things going to customers and talking to them in a big way. So my question to you, we have this customization page for studios where it's like, 15 pages customization process where customers spend like 5 minutes when they're excited about product. Do you think like the more expensive the product, the more time users should spend on like really customizing, making all these decisions, and all of this is like should be simplified?
There's certainly an element where the longer or deeper the interaction that the user has, the more willing they are to spend time kind of setting it up, or like the onboarding cost can be higher. But I think you'd be best off finding an approach that's a little bit more dynamic, where if a user starts using the product for the first time, you make it super dead simple and really just try to communicate the very essence of the product, and then later kind of further disclose the other stuff that it does and maybe get the user into that. So like this is the thing that we do in Google Photos. When you first onboard to Google Photos, we try to make it very clear that this is a product for looking at your photos, and it puts them all into one place in your Google Photos account so that you can access it everywhere else. We don't really talk about any of the sharing stuff or any of the AI stuff or the search stuff in that first experience. We try to get you to focus on the essence of what you're doing. And then later we kind of like iteratively disclose these things and get you to be aware of them. Yeah. Any other questions? No? All right, well, thanks for having me. If you have other questions, find me afterwards. How's that? Cool? Great. Thanks, everybody.